I wanted to talk about this being like the fifth video in a series that I'm doing about Mystery Babylon the Great and everything that the Lord showed me from Scripture that I showed you. But today I wanted to talk a little bit more about this verse in Revelation 17:5 when it says about the harlot, and upon her forehead was a name written, Mystery Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth. Now I showed you all the scriptures where God was saying that his people had played the harlot against him, and the golden calf was the beast that this harlot was riding out in the wilderness, and the Egyptian Apis deity bull that was the golden calf that's related to Zeus, and that is the abomination of desolation that was put in the holy temple that caused it to be defiled. So I wanted to talk about that this name was written on her forehead and what this really is signifying. Well, I talked about that being the Lord said that she had a whore's forehead. She had this name written there. And I also showed you that I believe that the wedding hand where the wedding band goes, showing that you're married to your husband, is the reason why it's on the hand and the forehead, because it's a sign of defilement. It's a sign of idolatry, and specifically against God in this particular case. Because in Revelation 14:11 it says, and the smoke of their torment ascendeth up forever and ever, and they have no rest day or night, who worship the beast and his image, and whoever receiveth the mark of his name. So those who do not take the mark upon their foreheads or in their hands, they live and reign with Christ 1,000 years. In Revelation 19:20 it says, and the beast was taken, and with him the false prophet that wrought miracles before him, with which he deceived them that had received the mark of the beast, and them that worshipped his image. These both were cast alive into a lake of fire burning with brimstone. Guess who has a company that's called Brimstone? You'll never guess. The one who developed Microsoft. I can't say his name. Please don't put it in the comments section. And remember, I was talking about the two witnesses being killed in Jerusalem, because Jerusalem is spelled out by God himself in Lamentations, that Jerusalem and her people are the harlot riding the beast in the book of Revelation. It's not until Revelation 13, after the two witnesses have died and were resurrected and ascended into heaven, that was the last chance to believe that in the gospel message. When they don't believe the gospel message as delivered by the two witnesses, and they're showing signs and wonders that Moses and Elijah had performed before, and they should recognize that this is the testimony of God, this is the power of God. And we see in Revelation 13 then, after they don't believe it, then this is what's going to happen. He was granted power to give breath to the image of the beast, that the image of the beast could both speak and cause as many as would not worship the image of the beast to be killed. He causes all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hand or on their foreheads, and that no one may buy or sell except one who has the mark or the name of the beast or the number of his name. And here is wisdom. Let him who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it's the number of a man. His number is 666. Notice there that it specifically does say that the mark is on their foreheads and their right hand. And over in Israel, the wedding ring goes on the right hand. And in Europe, they put the wedding ring on the right hand. It's only the West, basically, that's putting it on the left hand. So that was something I didn't know all growing up, but I knew somebody that wore theirs on their right hand, and I then determined, that that was a European thing. So interesting that that is the wedding hand, that the wedding band goes on in Israel and Europe and all, and that's the hand that she has committed fornication, and the nations have been deceived by her fornications. And sorceries, it says, which I showed you was the word pharmakia, of course, as we've already talked about a million times. But it's very interesting that, it would show that she has rejected God as her husband, that she's committing fornication with other false gods and in an idolatrous way. So God is going to bring this punishment. So the mark of the beast comes at that point after the two witnesses have given the last testimony of Jesus and the power of the gospel message, his death, burial, and resurrection, to return us into a Garden of Eden-like state to dwell with God forever. And they're rejecting that. They're rejecting God as their husband, and they would rather, be a harlot, with playing the harlot with all of these other religions and bringing them in, and God is going to destroy it. And we know that in the same hour that the two witnesses are killed in the streets of Jerusalem, that a huge earthquake is going to come and destroy a portion of the city, and it says 7,000 people are going to be killed in the earthquake. So I just wanted to say that because I wanted to answer somebody questioning about Jerusalem being destroyed forever. It's really the Babylonian system that this scarlet harlot that was raised in purple, which it says in Lamentations that the sons and daughters of Zion were raised in scarlet and purple. And they had gold and gemstones at the temple. So anyway, I go into all of that in the first few videos, and I'll put the links below to those videos and try to link it with this one. So with the two witnesses, God has sent Israel these two prophets, these two individuals that he puts the power of his Holy Spirit in to perform the signs of God that their ancestors had seen before. And when they reject this, in fact, they're rejoicing that they're dead in streets because they don't want the gospel message there. They're rejecting it. Then God brings the judgment on Jerusalem, on the people, and part of the punishment is going to be that they receive the mark of the beast. So they will not live forever. They will perish and not have eternity with God because they have rejected his message. Walid Shobat was one of the first people to talk about the letters Chi Psi Stigma that he saw that were written in the New Testament, and he recognized it that it was the name of the crescent moon god. So he definitely believes that that Islam, when people believe in Islam and they believe in the crescent moon god, who's the greatest deceiver, his number one name, which is Satan himself, is the deceiver. It's interesting that he says that the thing that they wear that has the name of the crescent moon god is a badge of servitude. They also wear it on their right arm. So that is not really the same thing as the hand, and I believe because God's revealed that to me about it being the wedding hand, saying that you're married to God and his people are supposed to be married to him. And yet she played the harlot, and God took another bride for himself through Messiah Jesus. And that bride is going to go up and be with him and live forever, because he's the second perfect Adam that reversed the curse of death from the Garden of Eden. And then we're going to go back in to dwell in the presence of God again, like it was in the beginning. But this is really interesting to say, for God to say that his people had a whore's forehead, and this name is written on her forehead, Mystery Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots. Slaves were marked with tattoos in order to make them easily identifiable if they tried to escape. Criminals would have their offenses inked into their foreheads or other easily visible locations. So this is why she has this name in her forehead, Mystery Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots, the mother of all the abominations of the earth, which is what God says through the prophet Jeremiah, and about his people, that they have played the harlot against him. And they were supposed to be married to him, but they went and they played the harlot with all these lovers of all these other nations. So isn't this interesting that these slaves had their offenses inked, tattooed on their forehead? So it would basically say, if you were a thief, it would have the word thief. Since she's a harlot, it calls her Mystery Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots, means she played the harlot, and that was her offense. Another piece of evidence for this is that in the history of tattooing, tattoos were commonly applied to punish and functioned as notice boards of guilt. Similarly, slaves were branded on the forehead to show their inferior status. So this is what's happening in the book of Revelation, why she has that name on her forehead. It's basically a notice board of guilt for God's people that have played the harlot against him. And of course, we see that after the two witnesses are given the message, the last incredible message of the gospel, and they deny it, then comes the mark of the beast system. So God's going to give them over if they refuse him. But it says, similarly, slaves were branded on the forehead to show their inferior status. These tattoos could contain their own names or that of their owner. Or that of their owner is like a harlot, a prostitute that is owned by a pimp, or, she's basically a slave to a master type relationship. And this is what it's going to be when they put the mark of the beast on people. So the mark of the beast is actually going to be that you're subservient to some sort of person that's in more power position, like a master to a slave. It's a badge of servitude. And it's interesting that it was put on the forehead to show their inferior status. These tattoos could contain their own names or that of their owner. The Emperor Caligula, in an act of cruelty, thus tattooed noble Roman youths with his name before condemning them to slavery. Slave tattoos could also include instructions for onlookers. An ancient commentator on the Greek orator Aeschines reports that some slaves were marked with the command, "Stop me, I'm a runaway." These marks of slavery were not only humiliating and degrading, they also caused lifelong ostracism. In 2 BC and AD 4 respectively, tattooed slaves, even then released, could never aspire to the rank of citizen. They could only become freedmen with no political rights. Of course, we know in regards to the mark of the beast, it's the Greek word charagma, which by definition is a stamp, imprinted mark of the mark stamped on the forehead or the right hand as the badge of the followers of the Antichrist. So they're going to follow after the Antichrist. I guess that's the idolatry. That's why she's given herself over to betraying her husband, which is God, for this other faker. And the mark branded upon horses is another definition. And it also means thing carved, sculpture, graven work of idolatrous images. And I talked about how that could be used if they started tattooing the NFTs, where you had to buy and sell. The NFTs mean non-fungible tokens, and it's used in this banking world, and they're creating their own images. Some of them are false gods of ancient lands. Of course, charagma is number 5480 in Strong's Concordance, and they have the definition of a stamp, to impress, sculpture, engraving, a stamp, sign. So it means properly an engraving, etching, a mark providing undeniable identification, like a symbol giving irrefutable connection between parties. So if they give their allegiance to the Antichrist after the two witnesses are finished giving the gospel message, and they're slain and they're resurrected, and then all of the mark of the beast and everything happens after that event, then that means that they are basically giving an irrefutable connection between themselves and the Antichrist, as though they're married to him instead of God. Charagma also means brand mark, which originally any impress on a coin or a seal used by an engraver on a die stamp, a branding iron, later became the identification marker, like with an owner's unique brand mark. So it'll be a brand mark like what's on a coin, on the hand, on the forehead, identifying that you belong to that person. As in this case, it's going to be you've traded out your husband God for this character, and you've committed harlotry and adultery with this Antichrist person. Anybody that takes that as their identifying mark, of course, there is no hope for them for eternal life. It's over. Now you can really see why, when you understand about the wedding band being on the right hand and them being married to God. And, we are the bride of Christ because they rejected him as their king and they played the harlot. So now in the future, they're going to be continuing on with what they've done in the past. God's going to bring judgment. Now, I talked about how every nation was deceived, it says. The kings of the earth and all the nations were deceived by her sorcery. So when she was in the diaspora, when she went out, there were people that were non-believers in God, and they brought this defilement from Babylon into all the nations. And that's why America has bits of, I would say a lot of bits of Babylon. New York City has a lot of bits of Babylon. All these other countries. You got India that's got hundreds of thousands of things they call gods that are going to be destroyed. And, Islam, they're worshiping who they think is God, but it's Satan, because Satan has the name the greatest deceiver, and that's the number one name of the God they're worshiping. So they're deceived by that. And Moses put a warning in the Ark of the Covenant for the latter days for God's people Israel not to have worshipped false gods or, go into idolatry, because he knew what was going to happen in the last days. So if they bring out that Ark of the Covenant, will it have that warning that they will find in it? Or will it have been a copy that they make of the Ark? I don't know, but I do believe that perhaps the Antichrist is going to sit at some point in there in the Holy of Holies like it's his seat or throne, which it's not. It belongs to God. And also, as you know, in the slave days, they used a branding iron to brand people like a master and a slave, owning a slave, and that's how they would keep track of their slaves, by this horrible, horrible searing of the skin with some sort of identifying mark. And then it's going to be something like that. And will it be connected to the pharmakia? It's very possible that that's part of it. And I don't want to go into all the details about that because I don't want my video taken down. But it's very interesting that they used to do this in the slave trade. Even in ancient times, they would brand people in the skin with a number. They did this in the Holocaust with the Nazis to all the people that they did not consider real citizens and made them subservient to their evil and acting like their masters over slaves or over what they didn't deem these people worth living. And it wasn't just Jews. There were literally millions of people that were killed in the Holocaust, but you never hear about the other people. All you hear about is 6 million Jews, but there were millions and millions of other people that also were branded as subhuman and given a number on their arm. There is an interesting article by Martin Dinter and Astrid Koo from the UK, and their article is titled "Wounds Prepared with Iron, Tattoos in Antiquity." This could be the reason why God does not want an iron implement used to build his temple, because iron was used for branding slaves. And God, he doesn't call us slaves, he calls us friend. He doesn't have a master, subservient dictatorship like all of these other regimes have. And they say in this article, tattoos were commonly applied to punish and functioned as the notice boards of guilt. Similarly, slaves were branded on the forehead to show their inferior status. The Bible does mention that there were freedmen in the city of Jerusalem, so those would have been ex-slaves. It says, long before the Greeks and Romans, however, Near Eastern societies practiced punitive tattooing. By the time of the Pentateuch's completion in 400 BC, a strong taboo against tattooing had already developed in Jewish culture. This vehement social stigma is encapsulated in the prohibition recorded in Leviticus. You shall not etch a tattoo on yourselves. In addition, the 2nd century AD Mishnah stated that engraving with ink or pigment or anything that leaves an impression was a crime punishable by whipping. A long tradition of forced tattooing had engendered a negative view of tattooing among the Jews, which was later enforced by rabbinic commentaries. The medieval scholar Maimonides explained that pagans such as the Canaanites had tattooed their Jewish captives and thereby consecrated them to idols. So that's what's going on too. The tattooing or the mark on her forehead, the whore's forehead, is meaning that she's consecrated to idols. Indeed, the Jews viewed tattooing as unlawful due to its historical associations with idolatry and slavery. Along with slaves, criminals were also forcibly tattooed. These tattoos revealed their offenses and shamed them for past wrongdoing. The Roman comic writer Plautus notes that thieves were marked with the word FVR, which is Latin for thief. Cicero observes that those found guilty of false accusations received a K on their foreheads for calumniator. In the 3rd century AD, tattoos came to be associated with one dissonant group in particular, the Emperor Valerian, who reigned from 257 to 260, stigmatized Christianity by ordering that its adherents should be tattooed with crucifixes, according to the deacon Pontius. This punishment soon became common. Many confessors were sealed with a second inscription on their distinguished foreheads. The first inscription implied here is the invisible and yet indelible cross of baptism. Similarly, Hilary of Poitiers in 360 AD stated that bishops were tattooed with the phrase condemned to the mines. The degrading practice of forced tattooing was thus combined with the draconian penalties of hard labor and exile. So is that going to be part of what happens when they put the mark on the people in the time of the Great Tribulation? By marking individuals with unwanted signs, the state demonstrated its unlimited authority over its subjects' bodies. Moreover, given that tattoo removal was a difficult and dangerous process, tattoos signified permanent submission to the state. This link between fertility and tattooing was deeply rooted in Egyptian culture. Hathor, the goddess of motherhood, was served by tattooed priestesses. Nevertheless, religious tattoos were not always applied for fertility reasons. The Egyptians also tattooed their faces and wrists with arcane symbols so as to invoke divine protection. This article on tattoo.com says, some like Plato, who encouraged the practice, he once wrote that thieves should have their offenses marked on their hands and face, and those who were found guilty of sacrilege should be branded with a mark and banished from society. The historian Zonere wrote of a particularly nasty tale in which the Greek emperor Theophilus used tattoos to punish 2 monks who publicly disparaged him. His drastic retaliation included having 11 verses of vulgar pentameter inked across their foreheads and faces. It says the Grecian method of tattooing as punishment was replicated in Roman society, but as Romans tended to do, in a much larger fashion. They continued to ink their marks on slaves, criminals, and others deemed unfit by the Roman government. Slaves being exported in trade, for example, would have the words tax paid marked upon their foreheads. Well, won't that be something if the mark of the beast is connected something to that, seeing as how, just the events that are taking place right now. I mean, they won't be able to buy or sell, so we know it's going to have to do with the monetary system and likely with the tax system and the tax code. So these slaves would have the words tax paid marked upon their foreheads. Like, you paid your taxes. Many emperors have been documented as participating in this direct form of punishment, including Julius Caesar, Cicero, Galen, and Seneca. However, it was the Emperor Caligula that perhaps took this heinous act to the next level. Suetonius, one of the early writers of the Roman era, detailed events in which the sadistic mad emperor would erratically take it upon himself to tattoo members of his court, as if some form of pastime or hobby. Punitive tattooing continued into the war waged between Romans and Christians. A passage in the biblical book of Revelation refers to the whore of Babylon, who as a slave of the empire had her undesirable habits tattooed across her face. There are also mentions throughout the historic text that speaks of Christians surviving Roman imprisonment and returning home, where their tattoos were worn as badges of honor as they were upheld as heroes by their community. As most injustices do, tattooing the face as punishment did finally reach its end when Rome entered into the Emperor Constantine's rule. Rome's first Christian emperor, Constantine, who ruled from 306 to 337 AD, banned tattooing, stating that man's face was crafted in God's image and it was a sacrilege to deface it, regardless of the merit of the individual. The practice during the Greek and Roman era was considered to be the most horrific form of punishment inflicted upon those who were allowed to live. So that's what's going to happen in the book of Revelation. They're going to receive the mark of the beast, or his image, or the number of his name, or all three, perhaps. Tattoo culture has undergone many unique challenges and changes over its 5,000-year history, but its ghastly use during the Roman and Greek eras should be considered some of the practice's darkest days. Greek written records of tattooing date back to at least the 5th century BCE. The ancient Greeks and Romans used tattooing to penalize slaves, criminals, and prisoners of war. So it's, the crime was written on the forehead of what they were guilty of. They were subservient to their masters as some sort of either a sex slave in the case of a harlot. Greeks actually viewed those that bore tattoos as barbarians until 512 BCE, when they noticed that the ruling class of Persia was using tattoos to mark their slaves. The Greeks then adopted the practice of tattooing the faces of their own slaves, making it almost impossible for them to run away. So in the Great Tribulation, those that have the mark, they won't be able to run anywhere because they'll be able to find them. They'll be able to track them. Let's see, and Plato also noted in his writing of Greek laws that tattoos were placed on those that broke into temples and stole the treasures that they found there, making tattoos a part of the criminal and slave class. In fact, the Greeks used the same word for stigma and tattoo. And of course, Walid Shobat recognized Chi Psi Stigma, stigma, the tattoo. And that was the name of the crescent moon god that he discovered in his biblical research. It goes on to say Roman writers such as Virgil, Seneca, and Galenus noted that their culture took the same stance on tattoos as the Greeks did, choosing to only mark slaves and criminals as means to keep them separate from the rest of their people. Tattooing specific groups of people in this way made monitoring their movements very easy, and was even used as a form of punishment for misbehaving slaves or citizens that broke the law. So in the book of Revelation, those that receive the mark of the beast, or his image, or the number of his name, will they be so much easier to track, since we have the technology now that's far beyond anything that they could track people back then. And it was basically saying that it could keep track of the people that were tattooed, monitoring their movements very easily. This information, it just blows everything wide open as to what's going to be happening at that time. I have to tell you kind of a funny story. My mom was a very cultured woman. She was very well dressed, very coordinated color-wise, and always dressed in high fashion, high class. And she always looked like that on a daily basis. So one time we went down beyond Denver to some place to have some sort of meal for Mother's Day. And it was so strange. It was like a whole different class of people that was just like, where did these people come from? Everybody was underdressed. They were wearing all kinds of weird get-ups, and they were all full of tattoos all over themselves. And Mom and I just looked at each other like, what are we doing here? And I told her, I didn't particularly like, and I said, schlepping with the Canaanites. So we had a big laugh off of that because, she was supposed to have this nice Mother's Day meal at this place that was somewhere we had never been. And it was just like a whole strange class of people that were not anything like, how we grew up. And, it was just so strange. They were all tattooed, and it was like the Canaanites were here to have dinner. So it was pretty funny. A lot of people are tattooing just to have a piece of artwork on their body. I don't personally agree with it. My mom didn't agree with it. But there's a lot of people that are into that, which some say that'll make it easier for them to accept the mark of the beast when it comes. Sometimes over the centuries, these tattoos have been used by royalty, and sometimes they've been used as a rite of passage for the elite and wealthy. So that's just a little bit of the history, but you can see what's happening during the time of the Great Tribulation, particularly the last 3.5 years of the 7-year time of Jacob's trouble. So now you can definitely see that God had said that his people had a whore's forehead, a harlot's forehead. She had played the harlot against him. She was supposed to be married. The wedding ring is on the right hand in Israel and in Europe. And this is a form of idolatry to take somebody else and call them the Messiah. That's not the Messiah. He's going to be the Antichrist. And all of this just kind of sums up what tattoos and the branding iron was. And I definitely believe this has to do with God not wanting an iron implement used in the building of his temple. So basically, I'm calling this part 5 of the series of Mystery Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots, which I showed you was Jerusalem and the sons and daughters of Zion, and that God had said that his people had played the harlot against him. I hope you ponder these things. It's kind of a fascinating subject. There was a church here that I thought was very blasphemous when I went there because somebody suggested I go to a service of theirs. And they had made the crucified Christ the back of Jesus on the cross. And when I got closer up to it, the guy's telling me it's a mural. And if you can believe this, it was an image of every person in that church that had a tattoo. And they turned it into the back of Christ. I just thought it was completely blasphemy. Anyway, I will never step foot in that place ever again, and I thought it was horrible. So let me just leave you with this verse in Leviticus 19:28. You shall not make any cuttings in your flesh for the dead, nor tattoo any marks on you. I am the Lord. That's the New King James Version. King James says, Ye shall not make any cuttings in your flesh for the dead, nor print any marks upon you. I am the Lord. JPS Tanakh says, Ye shall not make any cuttings in your flesh for the dead, nor imprint any marks upon you. I am the Lord. The Berean Study Bible says, You must not make any cuts in your bodies for the dead, or put tattoo marks on yourselves. I am the Lord. That's Leviticus 19:28. Tattoos were always associated with people that were of a lower class, and namely because they were the marks of slaves, and they were the marks of people who had committed crimes or been involved in harlotry and idolatry. So that is one of the reasons why I personally don't think Christians should be getting tattoos. And, we're made in the image of God, and God did not make us with ink in our skin. So anyway, this is very informative. You can believe what you want to believe. I'm just telling you from Scripture what it says, and telling you what's going to happen in the book of Revelation, and that the harlot that has Mystery Babylon written on her forehead shows that she's defiled, that she's betrayed her husband and committed herself to fornication and idolatry, and betrayed her husband for another. Could this be the Antichrist, that she's traded God as her husband for this other one? I think that's what's going to happen. So anyway, this is some more information. I hope you appreciate it. God bless. Thank you so much for your blessings, and thank you so much for watching. Have a good night.